Final Fantasy IV. Now we're starting to get into the intricacies of the more, to me, the golden age of RPGs in gaming started here, for consoles specifically. Final Fantasy IV, to me, is a game that did a lot of things right. They didn't do it better than other games, even within the Super Nintendo one. You could say Final Fantasy VI had better graphics. Final Fantasy V had more versatility and freedom to do what you wanted to do with your characters. But I shit you not, Final Fantasy IV had not the best story, but a damn good one, and how it was structured. Regardless of all of the plot holes, and I'm sure there's some jackass with a YouTube channel about video game storyline plot holes for RPGs. I'm sure they're out there. Maybe I should be that guy to do it. I don't know. But out of all the Final Fantasy games ever made, that one is that storyline is the most solid. It is the most definitive Final Fantasy game out there. Which supports, and what supports that argument, it actually had a direct sequel that was considered very good. It had a interlude game that was also very good. It had it literally set the bar for all the other RPG game companies, or not companies, but the other people making RPG games tried to meet that bar. They never met the bar of 6, and they never tried to fuck with the bar on 5, because that was its own thing. They all tried to literally, in one way or another, emulate what Final Fantasy IV had kind of done. Yeah, there were other RPG games out that had their own take on it, even before 4, but 4 was the most successful. And one of the things, again, about it being remade, it's the most remade, if I'm not mistaken, it's the most remade Final Fantasy game, too. It's got the Nintendo version, and this is just based on American releases. There are also more releases on the in Japan than there were out here. There's that one, there's the Game Boy Advance, there's the PlayStation remake, there's the Nintendo DS, there was a Game Boy Advance remake. I mean, this game was remade the most for a very significant reason, because of how solid it was. You know, they didn't really have to do anything to it to make it a good game. It was solid. It's the same reason why Lunar, the Silver Star game, has been remade probably more than any other RPG game to date. I think it has been remade 8 or 9 times between the US and Japanese ones. I know that it was released on Sega CD, then Sega Saturn, then PlayStation. Then it got a Game Boy Advance release that had a lot of changes in it a lot of people didn't like. It had a PS2 release in Japan with a combo thing. I think it came with a combo game. And then it got another release on the PSP. I mean, this is insane. It keeps getting remade because it's a solid story. It's a solid game. They never change much in it except the way it looks, just upgrading the graphics and the music. Because they're good games and they sell. Good stories and good games sell. And this is the staple that makes Final Fantasy IV. Whether you like the game or not, it's hard to deny that Final Fantasy IV was the official bar setter. And, you know, Lufia, Fortress of Doom, and Rise of the Sinestrals tried to emulate it. Earthbound already was kind of doing what it did previous to that, so I don't really count Earthbound. It did its own thing, and what it did well. But ironically enough, Mario RPG, which was made by Squaresoft, and Chrono Trigger borrowed more concept, I think, how gameplay plays out. Borrowed a lot more from Final Fantasy IV than they borrowed from like 5 and arguably 6. That's a very big debate. Maybe I'd love to discuss it. I mean, the comment section below, discuss it. I'll try to answer as many questions or give as many opinions as I can. But again, to me, that's an interesting point that a lot of people like to overlook. That, again, Final Fantasy IV was the pioneer game for a lot of that stuff. And to me, though it never, like I said, it didn't do anything better than anyone else. It's a big statement. Its graphics were never better than the graphics in Final Fantasy VI or Chrono Trigger. The storyline itself was pretty basic, but it had a really big world. To me, it was more diverse than 6, and that's a debatable topic too. But the world of Ruin is not that interesting, and there's a lot of people who could explain it better than I could. And we'll get to that when we get to that. But it had a solid story. It had great characters, from Cecil to Tella. I think the worst character was Edward, and most of us agree with that. But they were there. Palom and Porum, Fusoya for the small time. He was, like, to me, the original Gandalf of Final Fantasy games in a way. Just the way I thought of him. But that story was dramatic. It had a huge impact. Had one of the best character deaths in a Final Fantasy game, being Tella. What about Ares? You know what? We'll get to Final Fantasy VII when I get there. And to be honest with you, it was a good death. It was a good death scene. A touching death scene. But I expected a lot of games at that time to be able to... I expected Final Fantasy VII at that game's development. I expected a little bit more, surprisingly. But Tella's death was good. His was very good. And if you haven't played it, you need to play it. It's an excellent game. Probably one of the top 3 best Final Fantasy games, hands down. All right. Final Fantasy V. Now, I made a comment in the beginning of the video. As Final Fantasy games progress, graphics and music always seem to go hand in hand. They always improve together. Now, this is one of the few times I take a step back and say, they did it ass backwards. They focus so much energy and so much time into their battle system because here we go. We have the job system returning. But this time we have more jobs. Characters can pull abilities from multiple jobs. Well, one other job plus the job you're in. So you've now made it a very complex system in comparison to other job systems that they had in the past, which was really just Final Fantasy III. Now, with that said, I like this job system. It was good. It's good mechanically. It did a lot of things right, and it was a progressive set of jobs throughout the game that you could do other things without penalizing yourself. My white mage picked up white mage, and what was the other skill I gave that white mage? I think Geomancer. And then my black mage was a summoner with black mage abilities. And then my jack of all trades character was a thief who became a ninja who picked up blue magic, and then I just did whatever the hell I wanted with him. And then obviously I had my warrior character. So here we go. I'm building the same kind of parties I did in Final Fantasies 1, 2, and 3 again. I'm kind of not happy with this freedom of selection. I preferred the standard setup. And this is how I really feel. Final Fantasy V as a whole was a step back from Final Fantasy IV visually. In many respects, visually. I think they went for quantity over quality. You had all these different character sprites. You had a lot less character sprites in the world, but you had so many character sprites for all the different jobs. You had a lot less intriguing music. Though there is good music in Final Fantasy V, I think the sound effects went kind of south, and I do think some of the music was moderate. At its worst was moderate. And at its best, there were some good tracks in there. I like I can't remember the name of the songs off the top of my head. I like the big opener, the overture. That one is cool. I liked some of the music, but none of the tracks ring Final Fantasy V except for the little lute one that they play whenever Bartz has his dreams or Butts has his dream sequences. Those, I like those, but that's about it. It wasn't a memorable soundtrack, especially after what we got from Final Fantasy IV, which was a wonderful soundtrack, an amazing soundtrack, and that game came earlier. So that's what I think happened here. And the story kind of went a little south. Golbez is a decent villain, and Zeromus was kind of weird, and yeah, we kind of been used to that already from the other Final Fantasy games with Garland, and then the real bad guy's Chaos. And we see this happen again in Final Fantasy IX, which is just silly. But at least Zeromus had a really cool presentation. I didn't like Exodus nearly as much as I like Golbez. And I'll be honest with you guys, just to give you a concept, of where I'm coming from with the visuals and stuff. I owned Final Fantasy VI before I owned Final Fantasy V. I had my Super Famicom, but I bought other games for it. I got Treasures of Rudra over Final Fantasy V just because my friend had told me that Final Fantasy V was not as good as Treasures of Rudra was, and that game was out at the time, and Terramungia, which was the third game in the Soul Blazer trilogy, which I did like the Soul Blazer trilogy, and I do want to do it at some point in a Let's Play. But, and I'll get to it eventually. But going back to Final Fantasy V, I'd played 6 already, and noticed the reused sprites that they borrowed from 5 and 6. And obviously as a kid, in 4th or 5th grade, I think, I saw it right away and said, okay, so the dragon sprite they used in Final Fantasy V is the same dragon sprite they used in Final Fantasy VI. But 6 looks a lot better overall. They did a lot more visually to it. So, to make myself feel better, they stole from Final Fantasy VI. And that's a stupid thing to say, and I know that's not exactly how it went, obviously not how it went down. But I never really found Final Fantasy V to be a good game. It wasn't bad. Don't get me wrong. It's not a bad game, and if you are an RPG fanatic, you should definitely play it. It's got a wonderful system, and the Go-Go in Final Fantasy V is the Go-Go in Final Fantasy VI. So if you think it's Rachel or Shadow or some bullshit like that, give it up. It's official from Square. That's exactly who it is and has always been. Though a lot of us in the US were like, who's Go-Go? Who's Go-Go? It's actually a cameo from Final Fantasy V. And don't ask me why they did it. They did it. Who knows? Who cares? Enjoy it. And you know, I just didn't like him. Now, I liked Gilgamesh, and I started liking that kind of dark humor or satirical villainy humor that started moderately showing its head, but we won't see it. Well, no, we start seeing it in every game from this point on, from the Turks to Kefka's strange behavior. Not villainous, but that kind of playfulness we see in Laguna, in 8, carrying so on and so forth. Zorn and, what is it, Corn and Zorn? Or Zorn and Thorn, I'm sorry, from Final Fantasy 9. It's kind of there, but it's poorly done. And obviously the playful, bullshitty stuff from 10, and it kind of died off in 10, to be honest with you. Those secondary villains that are interesting, or their traits, or the villains had interesting, humorous, kind of dark traits to them. Anyway, so that covers Final Fantasy V. Probably better. It's definitely better than Final Fantasy 2, and probably better than Final Fantasy 3. So I definitely recommend, if you are into the Super Nintendo RPGs and you want that Final Fantasy 3 experience without the restrictions in Final Fantasy 3, and you want a decent, well, not a decent, you want and you're okay with the basic story that they have, you'll probably like it for certain things. But at times when the story kind of, trudges along, you feel kind of let down. And yes, and actually, I do want to make this comment. There is a major death in every Final Fantasy game from Final Fantasy 3 on, I believe. I forget if there's 1 and 2. But, so, like I said, with Celus's death, or Ares' death, rather. Celes didn't die. With Aerith's death in Final Fantasy 6 or 7, that's probably why I'm not so attached to it, because it had been done so many times before in very similar manners, and in some ways more redeemable and less stupid. Why would you go and put yourself in that position, and what did you truly accomplish? Nothing. These people set out and did more realistic behaviors. And we'll get to, I gotta hold that for 7. I'm gonna save that for 7. And I'll talk about the goods and the pros and all that. And the cons and whatnot. So Final Fantasy VI. Okay, so now we're here at the end of the Super Nintendo's lifespan, kind of. And Final Fantasy VI comes out. Final Fantasy VI is an excellent game. Much like Final Fantasy IV, kind of, to me, what they did was they tried to balance the quality over quantity. Is exactly what they tried to do. So what they did, and how I like to view what they did, is you have this smorgasbord of characters. There's a lot of characters. What is it? Terra, Celes, Locke, Edgar and Sabin making the brothers Figaro. Oh god, Gao, Cyan, Strago, Realm, Gogo, Yumaro, Mog. Fuck, who am I? Shadow. I'm already at like what? I think there's 13 characters in all. And it just fucking, it goes on and on and on and on and on. And Gao is another one. You have Bannon at one point in your party. You're going to say General Leo's in your party at one point. There's a lot of characters. And the first thing I said was, good lord, there's so many of these characters. And I can only put 4 in a group? They should have let me put 5. Holy fuck. What they did was they got rid of the, in my opinion, this is what they did. They got rid of the job system, and every character had a specific job. However, by endgame, their jobs' functionality slowly dissipated. You didn't care so much about what their jobs could do. Less experienced players, I think, ended up liking Sabine, because he was default pretty straightforward. Now, there were tricks to make him significant, like you developed him more as a mage, which sounds weird, I know, but Bum Rush, Flame Dance, and Aura, all those attacks were based off of your magic stat, if I'm not mistaken. And so Sabine was more of a mage, whereas Edgar was more of a warrior type. And this is something we start seeing come into play. And this is something we start seeing come into play through Final Fantasy 6, 7, and 8, and 10. All the characters, though starting with unique paths, end up all coming out the same in the end, in a way, one way or the other. And how do we explain this? As you progress through the game, you get Espers. Espers, as you have them equipped, you learn magic spells. So everybody in the game's using some kind of shitty magic, whether it's Carbuncle's shitty spells or it's the shitty spells of Bismarck. You're just giving people spells so they have spells. So the idea that you have mages, you outright would think doesn't exist, but it does. Every single character has a set of base level 1 stats. Okay? Not that ever shows, because not every character comes in your party at level 1, but you can literally divide it down to level 1 and figure out where they came from and where their starting stats are. A lot of people know by default by now Realm is the best mage in the game. And Celis's Runic, Terra's Morph, and Sketch become kind of useless by endgame, and you really rely on those base stats far more than you rely on their job skills. So if some of you are wondering how to beat the dinosaurs and in Dinosaur Forest and all that, it's because you're not if you don't know why you can't beat them, because you're focusing in the wrong direction, or you're not using Vanish X Zone if you're playing the original Final Fantasy VI for the US release. With those jokes aside, so depending on how you've designed your characters, and some people didn't have to do any of that and could still beat the game just fine. So I'm not trying to be elitist or anything by saying this is how I went about and did it, but most people, their first, second, third, fourth time through, they just kind of made everybody stay on their jobs. Edgar had a few support spells, maybe a couple of healing spells, and you just used Chainsaw all the time, or you used Drill all the time, or you hoped that Air Anchor would work. With Sabine, you used Aura Bolt, Fire Dance, and Bum Rush. I doubt you used anything else. Maybe Mantra Magic, which levels up through the magic stat as well, to do AoE healing. But again, most people actually focused on strength with him, because you would think that is actually relevant. Gao was only as good as you got rages for him. Shadow, I think, was kind of a middle ground character. Like Locke, he was both offensive and magic driven. You could set him up that way. Cyan was probably, in my opinion, the shittiest character in the game. He was more of a strength-based character, but his support abilities, using the sword tech, were fucking crap. Now, if they made those a lot better, like you could just pick one right away, based on what level you were, or how often you used your sword techs or whatever, I'd be more inclined to use him. He'd be much more functional. And there's also a lot of ROM Final Fantasy VI's that patch that character to be that way, and he's actually more on par with like Edgar at that point, which makes him more tolerable. Mog is whatever, he's pretty good, but again, he's more melee than he is magic because of the offering and the dragon boots and the twin lances. Yeah, or dragon lances. I forget which one it is. Or the horn. God, I forget what the combo is off the top of my head. If I had all the relics and weapons in front of me, I'd know exactly what to put on them. And you can do 8 attacks with them or 12 attacks with them? 8 attacks. And if you set them up in the strength direction, giving them espers that every time they level up, it builds up their strength stat, they can do 8,000 damage 8 times in one attack and be off the screen to avoid getting hit by bad guys. Those are 2 beefy characters. Umaro is whatever. Gogo is kind of the worst statistically the worst character in the game, but he can do everything. He can cast any spell of any character in the party. You can customize his ability skill tree. Setzer's a mage if you're wondering, which ones are mages, which ones are Strago's another mage. So there's, it's pretty laid out, and you can tell by their characteristics and their stats who's good at what, and so on and so forth. So we talked about that. Their stories are pretty good, but I always have felt, even from the first day I beat Final Fantasy VI, that there was a lot of unnecessary characters, or I wish they would have developed them more. Gao, Shadow. I wish there would have been more intricacies in with the story involving them. Even Sabine starts kind of, the brothers figure out it focuses more on Edgar than it really focuses on him. And their relationship. There's a couple things that you see with the coin toss and that grows and whatever. But I always felt Sabine kind of gets the short sword. Umaro and Mog have no relevance to the story. Gogo, obviously, is a cameo. Who else is there? Strago and Realm are more situational. Like, if we were playing Final Fantasy IV, they're like Palom and Porum. They really are only necessary for a small section of the story, and then you don't really see them contribute much back in. So who does the story really focus around? It focuses around Terra, Celis, Locke, Edgar, Sabine at some points, and that's about it. Cyan at times, but very, even Cyan, who had probably the most dramatic introduction to the main cast. Once he's in the game and once he's in the main storyline, he's just there. Does that make the game's story bad? No. The story is amazing. It's at the same level as Final Fantasy IV, but now you have more character variety, more character behaviors. You have a lot more origin points, and you have much more development going on. And it also helps that you had a really good villain. You had Kefka Palazzo, and yeah, Kefka was a really good villain. Any fan of the franchise knows that, hands down, he was one of the best villains because his mannerisms. I mean, if you loved the movie Batman: The Dark Knight and you loved the Joker, I want someone to confirm this for me. I really do. Check when Final Fantasy III came out, and then check some of the Batman comics. Who did this crazy bullshit first? Was it Kefka or was it the Joker? Whether it's true or not, in my head, I've always felt that that Kefka did it first. Kefka, because I wasn't a big DC comic reader, I was more into Marvel at the time. The Joker was my first the Kefka was my first crazy villain. And when I started reading some DC comics and saw the Joker, being this more lunatic character, far more crazier than the one from Tim Burton's Batman. I mean, yeah, he was funny. It was Jack Nicholson pretty much being Jack Nicholson. But if that was the way he was in the comics, that was not the same as Kefka. Nowhere close. Kefka was much more like Christopher Nolan's Joker in Batman: The Dark Knight. And obviously, that actor's presentation of him, to me, I sat there and said, if there was a Final Fantasy VI movie, that's the way Kefka should be played. Like, that Joker. Okay? So, to the point where we see this character emulated, in my view, as a younger kid, and then seeing it done in like the Batman animated series later, you kind of start seeing this Joker. That's where I kind of think I really first started seeing some comparison, though it was mild. the Batman animated series started showing it, and then I really said, oh wow, the first thing I said in the theater when I'm watching Batman the Dark Knight, that's Kefka, that's not the Joker. As soon as he walks into the thing and he bashes the guy's eye through the pencil, want to see a magic trick? There, I'm gonna make this pencil disappear, and he just slams the guy's head, and we all know this scene, we've all seen it. That, to me, I sat there and I looked over at my buddy and said, fucking Kefka. And he looked at me and he goes, no, you've ruined this movie for me, dude. That's totally Kefka. They stole Kefka. Ah. And yeah, we were that nerdy and really kind of pointed that out in the theater in the middle of the movie. And some people knew what we were talking about. You could hear a couple of cackles in the back, and then you heard a lot of people going, shut up. Anyway, that's why I don't go to movies as often as I used to. I'm that jackass who makes fun of the movie as the movie's playing. So it had a memorable villain. And speaking of that villain, he was... and since if you affiliate him to Batman the Dark Knight, I still... with that mentality and how he viewed the world and wanted to just see the world burn, he wanted to control the world in a sense and have fun. Kefka single-handedly killed the most people out of not a goal, not really any kind of goal where like Sephiroth killed people to forward his plan. Kuja killed people and destroyed countries to do what he wanted to do. Golbez did the same thing. Exodus did the same thing by trying to combine the two worlds together. Okay. Yeah, so this becomes a staple in Final Fantasies. I get that. Kefka was the only one to break that cycle and do it in such a way that it never had been attempted or accomplished at the same respectable level. There are other villains from other games that tried to do it, and they do a good job, but they never really quite reached Kefka's level. He liked killing people to do it. He liked doing it for the same reasons the Joker did from that same movie. He kills all the people in Cyan's hometown, Roma, because he could, and he wanted to hear them scream in agony, pain, and suffering. He disobeyed direct orders just so he could have fun, and that to him is fun. Okay, now that's obviously the big argument many people make for Kefka being better than you know who, and that to me is not that's not enough, but he does much more. If you've played Final Fantasy VI, you know what he's done, and he's the only villain in practically video game history for a long stretch of time who was actually successful in what he set out to do. I mean, you had a lot of villains who almost conquered the world, almost destroyed the world. They received the ultimate power in the universe and could take over the world, but the heroes came in and saved the day. No, this fucker took the world over. He killed a lot of people. He made orphans out of an entire city just because he felt like it. He had a cult dedicated to him. He sat atop a tower as a deity in his world, and from there pretty much killed anyone who disobeyed him with a giant godlike beam that severed and rendered the world asunder. He destroyed the world of balance that they lived in, thus creating the world of ruin. He wanted to do it because he wanted to see it happen. It was something he enjoyed. That is an amazing and complex villain, not just sadistic and crazy, because we see him change throughout the game, getting darker and darker and more fucked up. But you see him progress this way at a very good moderation with everything else going on in the story. The grand manipulator, but you never see him doing it. But when he does it, it's a huge deal. When he kills General Leo, when he kills the Emperor, when he tries to burn Castle Figaro to the ground, and he's making jokes outside the castle as he's doing it. These are big things that people shrug off as, oh, whatever. It happened to 2D characters. It doesn't matter. Bullshit. You're an asshole, and you're useless, and you are You have no concept of how to analyze anything or respect a good story when it's presented to you if you care about what the game looks like and how that character portrays himself in that world. When that villain hit the big screen for me, as far as on my 32-inch tube TV that I had, and I saw him do the things that he did, you felt senses of dread, anger, and hatred and towards this character far more than I think any character in the Final Fantasy franchise. But this was a big deal. It did. Now, here's the one beef that I did have with Final Fantasy VI, which is a beef that even people who really liked the game didn't like. It builds up really, really well until you get to the float. And once you do the floating continent, I'm not going to tell you everything, but you do the whole floating continent stuff. Once you've done that and you get to the world of Ruin, the game kind of slams on the brakes. All that build-up, all that tension to that. And then really you can beat the game within about 5 hours from there if you just want to get it over with. Yeah, there's all the side questing, and that develops the characters a little bit more than where they have been and all that, but, you know, the game at that point loses a lot of its appeal, and you just kind of start going, okay, alright, so now Kefka's he is God in this world, and the whole party is dispersed by force. Okay, Celis is on an island alone. She thinks all her friends are dead. The whole world is destroyed. She thinks she may even be the only one left alive in the world. And you have the option to go around and collect almost all of your characters and get some new ones, which are all novelty. But it's still, the question and point still stands. The game, as far as story and development story goes, just kind of comes to a crawl. And as you go and you do the character development and the side quests and stuff, you start realizing that you're just trudging along, doing developmental stuff as opposed to the main story. And really that developmental stuff has no major effect to the main story other than how many characters you have at endgame to fight Kefka with. Which you can go to Kefka in the final battle and fight with every character you had in the game, excluding obviously Banon. And it's awesome. Because it's the only time in a Final Fantasy game, really, if you didn't level your characters a lot or you didn't do a lot of good developmental things with them, you may need all 13 characters to beat Kefka, or 9 characters, 9, 13, however many there are, to beat Kefka. And that, in itself, just saying that, should define epic final boss battle. So Final Fantasy VI, was it better than 4? It did a lot of things. It excelled at a lot of things. It excelled at having a really good build-up. It didn't excel at a climax. Once the floating continent climaxes, it just kind of drudges on. Which isn't a lot of gameplay. I mean, you can beat most of that gameplay in like 8 hours, 10 hours. You can get through a lot of the side quests in about that time if you know what to do. So, all in all, you know, depending on how you feel about it, you know, some people liked it, some people didn't. But that build-up to the floating continent is epic. If they could have kept that momentum going till the final confrontation, it would have been the best Final Fantasy of all time. But you know what? Final Fantasy IV kept the momentum all the way through the game. I never felt it drag on at any point. There's always something to do, and it never really slammed on the brakes. 6, once you get to the world of Ruin, you're kind of like, okay, so where's the build-up? And that build-up never happens because we never see Kefka again. We never interact with him till endgame. We only see the remnants of what he had done to the world. And that alone isn't enough to carry that villain any further than where he was. So, Final Fantasy VI is definitely a must-play. It is a great RPG game, and it still holds up to today's standards as far as good storytelling, good character development for the most part. If you want really a solid story from beginning to end, I'll tell you to play 4. If you want a huge versatility at your disposal, you want to see a lot more variety in characters and places and formats, you know, storytelling, pick up Final Fantasy, play Final Fantasy VI first. You'll get a little bit more out of that, probably. So there's the Super Nintendo era right there in a nutshell.